Okay. Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum Speaker Podcast Series. My name is Anaf Kalam, and I will be moderating today's discussion. We are pleased to be joined by General Eran Ortal, Reserve IDF brigadier-general and military theorist. Join us to discuss Israel's defense strategy after October 7th. Mr. Ortal will speak for 15 minutes, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A from the audience. If you should wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I will turn the discussion over to General Eran Ortal.
Thank you very much, Anaf, and good afternoon to everyone. It's evening here in Israel, and thank you for having me. It's an honor. It's an honorable forum. Let me start the discussion with saying that I will try to shed a new light, a different angle on the war in Gaza and maybe the coming war in Lebanon. So you might have heard and read briefs and publications about the war itself, about the politics of it, about the current strategy. I will try to take an overview and do it from a strictly military and strategical angle, leaving politics beside. They are important, of course, but I will try to shed some new light. So with that in mind, there are four main takeouts that I would like to highlight this afternoon. First, let me comment that the war in Gaza is Israel's first total war. By saying total war, I mean that this is the first war where we are committed not only for the military defeat of the other side, but also to the political defeat of the other side. This is a new kind of war in Israeli history, and it is really outside of our true measurements. So that's the first takeout. The second one is that we have cornered ourselves into that position in a long process that I will talk about in a minute. The third point is that cornered ourselves that I was talking about is a result of an unrealistic derailment of Israel's traditional defense strategy. I will, of course, talk about that briefly also. And finally, the good news is that I think that we can and should fix that, but that is deeply dependent on a really profound learning process to be made after this war. And maybe that is what we will start here. So when I say Israel's derailed defense strategy, first, I need to say what is our traditional defense strategy. Its main assumption, its main observation back in the 50s when Israel was a newly born state was that we are David against Goliath in the Middle East, in this neighborhood. We can never defeat and change the hostility of the Arab states around us just by winning a war. But the other way around was not only realistic, but actually the aim of Arab-Israeli wars from their side. Their wars were aimed for one final defeat that will make Israel disappear from the map. And what that observation meant is that Israel would build its force for short, decisive wars. Those wars were aimed only for the operational rather than strategical defeat of the other side. And they will take shape by taking war to the other side, outside our borders, and directly removing the military threat on Israel. So basically, That's what have worked for us for our first 4 decades. When I say derailment, now we move fast forward into the 90s. So in the 1990s, we are in South Lebanon because 10 years later, earlier, we had to remove the threat of the PLO that was based there and threatening our civilian population on the border. We found ourselves in South Lebanon fighting what was becoming a small guerrilla force, a Lebanese one, and there was no Arab army that the Israeli might could take off balance as we used to. But at the same time, Israel had a new sense of complete military supremacy. May I remind you, 1990s, the Cold War is over, the Soviet Union has just fallen, the Egyptians are now outside the war circle with Israel after the peace agreements from the 70s. And the IDF, just like the United States military forces, has just gone through what they called back then the revolution in military affairs. Basically, it meant that we were the most modern military force around, with elite capabilities of targeting and directly and accurately striking many targets of the other side. So we felt quite confident with ourselves. And with that circumstances, new strategy was starting to emerge. And it was based on utilizing the newly acquired modern air power of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, and utilize it to degrade and deter what was becoming then the Lebanese Hezbollah and its state patrons. Why do we need to deter the state patrons of Lebanese Hezbollah? Because the one that thought about this new strategy realized that it has some faults. Modern air power is very effective against states, but it is less so against guerrilla forces, which are stealth and hard to target. So they were looking for the responsible state behind the guerrilla force, and that became the focal point. If we can deter by air power Lebanon, and if Lebanon is too weak, then the Syrian regime behind the Lebanese state, then we could deter and restrain the guerrilla forces working against us in South Lebanon. So gradually, and without really telling ourselves what was going on, a new basic strategy was starting to emerge to replace the other one I was talking about earlier. Now, Israel was thought as the Goliath of the neighborhood by ourselves. We are the strong guys. We started to look at ourselves as a regional size sort of superpower. No one really to threat Israeli existence in the neighborhood. Air power campaigns are really wars of attrition. Everyone realized that. But now, in the new circumstances, we can have wars of attrition. Back in the old days, war of attrition was the last thing Israel wanted. What we really had to have during conflicts is quick, decisive operations, so we can end them before attrition starts. A small state cannot withstand a war of attrition. This new strategy of graduate, slow, strategic attrition war that was taking the shape of many operations every couple of months, every couple of years, first in Lebanon, then in Gaza Strip, was becoming such a dominant strategic theoretical framework that, again, fast forwarding to the new century, back in 2007, after Israel has withdrew its forces from Gaza Strip completely and its citizens. And when the Hamas took over Gaza back in 2007, some of our leaders and even generals, including our intelligence commander, were actually pretty glad. They thought that Hamas taking over Gaza was actually a good thing. Now Hamas would become, just like they thought about Lebanese Hezbollah in Lebanon, will become a sort of a state-like and will adopt a logic of state responsibility. Therefore, it will be much easier to deter and restrain Hamas by air power without the ongoing conflict and friction on the ground. But there were some harsh realities. In fact, Lebanese Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas did not accept that logic of state responsibility. On the contrary, they had used their newly acquired territory in Lebanon and in Gaza to build what Americans might have called A2AD stealth armies. When American armed forces say A2AD, what they mean is anti-access area denial entities. Basically, that means that if you have enough fires for multiple ranges and with enough accuracy, you can deter and hold back the superpower from coming to restore order after you make some provocations. So Hezbollah and Hamas have acquired enough firepower to hold back Israel from coming to sort out things in Lebanon and Gaza again. And not only so, they were aiming enough rockets and missiles on our cities and on our once we left Lebanon and Gaza, Lebanon in 2000 and Gaza in 2005, the other guys had decades to build up their forces under the cover of the deterrence of rockets. And the current situation is that after 20 years of Hamas rule, it is impossible now to do what we have done when we fought the Egyptian army or the Syrian army. It is impossible to separate the military forces from the political echelon. And thus, right now, we are in a war where we are committed to both the defeat of the military Hamas and of the political Hamas. And this total war to unroot Hamas, really, the situation right now is that it proves too much for Israel. The lesson here is that when we thought of ourselves as a regional superpower, we have really did not look back to have another look if the circumstances might have changed again. And the military lesson here is to devise a way to defeat in the next war, at least Lebanese Hezbollah military, without resorting to the same tactics we are now engaged with in Gaza, which is to clear Gaza completely, house to house, with boots on the ground. Just imagine that tactic being tried out in Lebanon. 6 months into the war, the IDF is really fatigued. It's out of resources and out of energy. So I wanted to name out the three major disruptors of our traditional defense strategy. First one is the control of hostile population on hostile territories. You cannot have decisive campaigns against guerrilla forces. The second one were rockets and missiles. Rockets and missiles have made it impossible for us to disengage Gaza and Lebanon. We have disengaged Gaza and Lebanon, but they kept coming after us. The third one, the major one, is Iran. We went to bed in the 1990s thinking we are in conflict with Lebanese Hezbollah, and later on with Hamas in Gaza. Those were isolated, small adversaries. One day we wake up, and these are not small, isolated guerrilla forces. These are just the paws of the huge Iranian tiger. And thus, we are now, again, the Davids of the neighborhood fighting the big tiger, ancient Persia. So the real meta-disruptor is not the other side, but ourselves. Thinking of ourselves as a modern high-tech regional superpower, the Israeli strategy did not stop to reconsider our position. And as the Iranian involvement grew and Hamas and the Lebanese Hezbollah capabilities enhanced, Israel was no longer degrading them in a strategy of attrition, but the other way around was true. It was the Iranian degrading and fatiguing and attritioning us. So you can look at this hard war in Gaza as a rehabilitation experience for the Israeli strategy. So I know now I'm sort of a party pooper and a morale breaker, but I do believe we have way ahead. Our mistake was the false assumption that we were no longer the Davids. The lessons is to readapt our capabilities in order to preserve what was clearly more realistic and valid defense strategy. And the main point from those three disruptors I've mentioned was the tactical one. If you can figure out a way to defeat rockets and missiles, you actually also have a solution for the complete Iranian strategy, and you can even withdraw from hostile territories without being deterred from engaging them again and again if you don't have the deterrence of rockets and missiles. Now, I know our time is running out. I will open it to Q&As enough, but I don't want to leave those statements in the air. So if any of you guys are interested in the military level of my statement that we can solve this problem and make another new adapted revolution in military affairs, I can refer you to some of my publications that were published in the invitation for this evening, Fighting Fires with Data from Hoover Institution in 2023, and Turn on the Lights, Extinguish Fires that was published in 22 on War on the Rocks. Thank you.
Well, thank you, General, for that presentation. Our audience is a little bit quiet today, so I guess I will begin with a question of my a question of my own. I would like to ask about the withdrawal, or rather the partial withdrawal of IDF forces from Gaza over the weekend. And of course, Hamas has declared this as a victory on their part. Would you say that this could be attributed, at least in part, to Israel regrouping and regathering their forces for a potential larger scale war with Hezbollah and the IRGC following the strike on Mohammed Zahedi?
So first, I have no inner knowledge nowadays. I really don't know. One can assess that something is going on behind the scenes with a new hostage deal. I truly hope so. One can also assess that the IDF is regrouping towards the next step in Gaza itself, whether it will be Rafah or somewhere else. But returning to my brief, the main point is not the withdrawal from Gaza from yesterday, but the actual declining effort in Gaza, the declining IDF effort in Gaza in the last 2 or even 3 months, which points out not only to the degradation of Hamas, and we have degraded Hamas quite successfully, but also to the IDF's lack of capability to sustain this kind of effort for months and months, which goes back to my first point. We must figure out again the way to decisively take out our adversaries and do that in the military level alone.
All right. Well, thank you. We're getting some audience questions now, all of them at the same time. I'll start with a question from Richard Galber. Has the leadership of Netanyahu contributed to this wrongthink that actually affects Israel today?
Well, thank you, Richard. Well, I'm a military man, not a politician. I will try to keep it on the professional level. But facts are facts. Prime Minister Netanyahu was the dominant politician and dominant prime minister for almost all those years since the 90s. So his leadership is of course, part of it, and I did not go to the analysis of the war itself and the particular policy that we had with Hamas in the last 15 years, which is to appease Hamas in order to ease the situation in the south, but also to weaken the Palestinian Authority. But being a military person and analyzing it from my point of view, I would like to say that one of the weaknesses in Israel is the lack of involvement from our political leadership in the military business. So militaries are known to resist changes. And here is a case where change was needed and is really late in coming. And I will point out the failure of both the IDF and our political echelon to recognize the change needed and adapt in time.
Okay, thank you. Here's kind of a wider, larger question. It comes from our viewer, Mindy Stein, who starts by saying, you cannot leave his speech the way it is. He has to talk now about military content. He has told us too little of how to fix this. Can you kind of add on to that a little bit and maybe address more of the military context there?
I'll be happy to. It's my favorite. I try to go around it, figuring out this audience is not a military audience, but basically two things. Our adversaries has two things going for them. First is their ability not to be recognized as targets, to avoid being a target, to avoid being acquired by us as targets. And the other thing that stands for them is standoff fires. They can launch rockets, missiles, and UAVs from distances while still being in their hiding places. If you take those two elements out of the equation, they have nothing else to fight for. And new technologies can now make the combat environment saturated with multiple and various sensors. So in the context of a stand-in fight with troops on the ground, the other side would find it very hard to avoid being acquired as targets. And the other element is connecting those sensors to close by short-range, very accurate and very fast missiles. If you connect these sensors and effectors networks, and you do that from within the battlefield, from close ranges, you can now not only target the enemy fighters, but you can also target the enemy launching points and AT tank launchers. And you can even intercept the outgoing fire of the other side, not only when it reaches our cities with Iron Dome, as you all familiar, but also do that on the other side territory. So imagine now our troops maneuvering in Lebanon or in Gaza, and the adversary find itself much destroyed in a much more quick tempo and without successes of launching against our forces or our cities. That will really make waking up for a new day of fight much harder than you can imagine in the maybe nearby war in Lebanon. I hope I was successful in clearing up the idea.
Well, thank you. On a similar note, we have a few questions coming in. One of them comes from Carrie Hillebrand, and the other comes from, excuse me, let me find it, from Stephen Orlo. Stephen asks, with respect to your final point regarding defense against rockets and missiles, can you comment on the laser system, the Iron Beam system, that has been spoken about by Israeli officials? And Carrie Hillebrand asks, when will the Iron Beam be deployed? How effective will it be to degrade enemy rocket fire?
So anyone who knows something about military technologies and laser specifically knows that first, it is a huge development. It's important because it takes a lot of the money from the equation. It makes interception much cheaper, but it also has its downsides. It has limitation with weather. It has limitation with quantity of interceptions that you can do in specific timetable. But coming back to my point, so it is important, and they tell us it's almost done. There was even a prototype deployed in this war, but not activated from various reasons, which I will not go into. But the main point that I was making was not about ballistic and missile defense. It was taking ballistic and missile defense technologies into the offensive. And that is another conceptual framework. That is why it takes so much time. What we need to do in the militaries is change not only our weapons and technologies, but also our state of minds. We are addicted to stand off engagements. That means waging wars from far away. And what we are now experiencing in Gaza is a new thing for the last few decades. It's really hard, close ranges, boots on the ground fight. And we have crossed that Rubicon. So I think we are now ready to move the one step further ahead, which is take the war with rockets and fires to the other side.
All right, thank you. And to follow up here on that, you may have kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but we have a question from Alex Landsman, who asks, how would Israel approach a multi-front rocket and missile attack that would overwhelm the Iron Dome?
So thank you, Alex, for the question. It is not an imaginary scenario. This is the actual plan of our adversaries. So going back to my point, the system works like that. You can overwhelm Iron Dome with multiple, and you need really a large quantity of salvos coming in. You can only do that from Lebanon or Gaza. I mean, from our borders. You cannot do that from Iraq, Syria, and Iran because the salvos will not be big enough. The idea is to engage in the same time with large salvos from Lebanon and Gaza and with precision munitions from further away. But if you can take out the multiple launch systems from the proximity of our borders, that means so standard multiple barrel launches with Hezbollah will be 48 barrels of 122 millimeters rockets. I know, a lot of data. That will take approximately 40 seconds to a minute and a bit to embark. I mean, from the first rocket to the last one. If I can hit this multiple barrel launcher while it is still activated, I can cut the salvo in half and even better. So if I can do that on my borders, I can remove the threat of the large salvos and therefore make my defense system, the overall defense system, much more resilient and effective for the other threats coming in. So that will be the wider view, and it's a good question because it helps to understand the new concept.
All right. Well, thank you very much, General. Unfortunately, we have come to the end of our podcast. Thank you again for joining us today. And before we go, is there anywhere where our viewers and listeners can go if they would like to follow more of your work?
Yes, sir. So I've referred to the works in Hoover Institution. There's 3 publications over there, 2 of them about Israeli strategy and 1 with the point of harvesting technologies to military needs. And there's a complete overview of the concept I've just briefed about in War on the Rocks, Turn on the Lights, Extinguish Fires. And anyone can go into my LinkedIn or Wikipedia page and go through my complete works. And thank you, Anaf, again for having me today.
Yeah, well, it's been my pleasure. And for our viewers, please join us on Thursday, April 11th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time for our Israel Insider podcast with Ashley Perry. And please note the change in time for that podcast. If you try to tune in on Wednesday at 3 p.m., neither Ashley nor myself will be live on the podcast. And once again, we would also like to remind our viewers and listeners of the Middle East Forum's upcoming policy conference celebrating our 30-year anniversary. It will be taking place from May 13th to May 15th in Washington, D.C. We will feature policy panels covering Israel victory, threats from Turkey, Iran, and Qatar, countering Islamism in the West, and much, much more. You can sign up on our website under the Activities tab or sending an email to events@meforum.org. We hope to see you all there. And once again, I thank you for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.